Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Hibay. I'm the API platform architect at WSFS Bank. And as such, I must include the customary employment and recruiting blurb. We are a regional bank in the Wilmington, Delaware, and Philadelphia area. And in my very biased personal opinion, we're doing some really cool stuff. Uh, Please connect if you'd like to know more. Um, uh, Before I get started with the story, I need to give a disclaimer. This is a real fake story or a fake true story, a fictionalized true story. All identities, details have been changed to protect identities and IP of all involved parties. So, regardless of your background, whether you're an engineer, an architect, product owner, business leader, however your involvement with APIs and API platforms in particular, there's one question I hope resonates with anybody in any of those roles. Um, and I'd like you to keep this question in mind throughout the rest of this story here as a insert your role here. How do I know that API platform customers and consumers are successful? Is a really important question. And at the same time, it's really ambiguous. Um, More on that in a bit. So before we get into the story, let's set the stage and understand who our key actors are and participants in this tale. Our consumers in this case are the enterprise blog post publishers. The customers are our blog post authors. And it's very important to the regulators, the Enterprise Blogging and Author Protection Agency, that certain disclosures and timelines and other rules are followed to enforce copyright and protection against fraudulent publishing. This analogy is very thin. Now, to set the stage, and right before we were joined, my team and I were brought in because an important part of the system that does the accounting, record keeping, and publishing of new blog posts was being retired as support was ending for the system. And our customers, the enterprise blog post publishers, needed to be sure that they could keep posting new blogs and paying new authors. The publishers came to us with a solution that fit the exact hole that was about to fit in their process. But they also really didn't like their current process or how fragile and error prone it was. There was a lot of places where people had to manually copy information from one place to another to move the process along, and there wasn't a good way for them to verify the information is the same in all the places when they were done. In other words, there was a lot of swivel chair processes going along here. So now that we understand the context, we'll pick up the story at the start of our first meeting with the publishers. And as we kick things off, the publishers, as I said, described their situation and were very insistent that they understood the problem and what they needed to have happen and how much we needed to help them. However, instead of immediately trying to fix their problem or the other issues that they were describing to us, we asked them to tell us what is their ideal process and explain it to us. And believe me, there was a lot of skepticism and more than a touch of resistance at this tangent from what they thought needed to happen. But little by little, over time, we helped them understand how these discussions were part of the process of us helping them fix things. And they warmed up a little bit. And while we were helping them explore their ideal process, something very interesting happened. Collectively, we identified a lot of ambiguous words that seemed to mean the same thing to everybody on the surface, but had some striking differences when we all dug a little deeper. One word in particular really stood out from the others, and it was really surprising: published. We thought this was really interesting because on the surface, it seemed so fundamental to this entire process. And yet, as a group, they didn't agree on what it meant. It turns out that the EBAAPA is very strict on allowing authors the right to publish or unpublish a blog for any reason within a couple days of it being published. The relevant tools from many of the vendors had varying definitions of what published meant. And as a consequence, the publishers who worked with those tools at various stages of this life cycle had internalized the vendor's definition of published, and none of these definitions really aligned all that well. And not only did we find out that the definition was ambiguous, we discovered that different groups had entirely contradictory definitions of the word. Now, in my experience, this is pretty common, and it only comes to light when you press on these topics or concepts that are ambiguous and vague on the surface and dig a little deeper. When all the publishers also realized this, the mood in the room changed dramatically. A good deal of skepticism with the approach was replaced with interest and willingness to lean in and imagine their ideal publishing life cycle. This process started at the very beginning of the pipeline, right? The initial writing and publishing of the blog posts, all the way through payment and publishing. And along the way, we found more ambiguous words, and like published before, we wrote out all the necessary words and definitions, decided on an unambiguous term to identify each of these various subtly different concepts, right? And we also found areas in their process where none of their products or tools had even covered. They weren't covered by any of the definitions we had either. And we defined some words for those too, right? And we kept going until we could describe the flow that they wanted with the words that we had defined as a group. At the end, we came up with a process that looked more like this. And between our sessions with the publishers, we took these definitions and we created some rudimentary schemas, including the definitions of these words, right? As well as rough guesses at various properties that might be involved in an implementation of this message, either digitally or on paper form. And this is where the hype comes in with the strategy. See, what we didn't tell the publishers is that there's a few big reasons to be clear about the words in addition to helping them discover issues with their collective understanding of their ideal process. The other reasons were for us, kind of, but it really depends on how you look at it. So, in order to understand the capabilities the team wanted us to create or facilitate, we had to get the business to agree on a set of definitions, vocabulary we could use to represent these different things, messages, capabilities, right? All these things that our interface would have to provide in some way and expose if we were going to deliver a digital system that would give them these capabilities. We would have to have a solid understanding of what they were after. And while these definitions aren't set in stone, right, and it's not really a big deal to change them, they did need to be written down and collectively agreed upon so that we could all be sure what was true and what we were after. Be collectively agreed on. Now, the next time that we met with the publishers, we had a running clickable demo of the UI pages and this process that we outlined together using our newly defined flows and schemas, right? And by itself, that's not too big of a deal. There's a lot of tools out there that enable this kind of thing, but the way that we did it is really the interesting part. See, there's a subtle truth about APIs that isn't very well understood. APIs are the socio-technical language of a digital organization. They are the place where people and process meet technology and have the opportunity to speak the same language. Not a guarantee. See, the UI pages, the demo that we built, uses a generic hypermedia client that discovers, explores, and follows flows and metadata sent by the server, defined and using the business language and schemas that we built with and for the publishers. When the elements appear on the screen, they are coming from schemas that we defined directly from the language and the messages and representations that are sent around. And when we modify those schemas and those messages, those elements are reflected in the experience immediately. Once we understood the conversational message between these different actors and entities or resources in the system, we add hypermedia to the resources, and the API interactions and the UI agent presents this information or these affordances and capabilities using the hypermedia and the other data sent by the API. We didn't spend any time building a UI. All we did was write some schemas, right, define some messages and resource mappings, and create a few process flow definitions from what we defined with the publishers about what they wanted to have happen. The UI is just a generic agent, thin client that strictly follows a set of rules. And we have a mock service that's able to interpret these flow definitions, these resource mappings, and produce the hypermedia that will give us the experience to go from the beginning to end of the process. And we get a clickable running demo to present to our colleagues. Now, there's two big points here I want to make sure comes across. The user experience implicitly matches the business's flows outcome. It literally is defined by it, and it matches it 100% of the time. And again, to reemphasize, this iteration, this demo, wasn't some off-the-shelf throwaway code. This wasn't some kind of a product for creating demos or iteration on design. This was an early design iteration, an early version of the running system that we would ultimately deliver to the clients. The messages may change, the implementations will be more real, but it was always using the technology at the core that would be part of the solution. So we showed the publishers this demo, and we immediately got actionable feedback on the designs. Nuances to messages and conversations that hadn't come up yet, we hadn't discovered or hadn't been prompted. And most exciting of all, we refined these ideas on how we could continue to improve these interim solutions, as well as enhance their ideal process, both now and down the line. And by this point in the engagement, both our team and the publishers together started to look for all of these ambiguities and go after them. We all understood to a degree that these ambiguities caused issues for both our teams, our business teams, and their processes, as well as the implementation of these technical capabilities down the line. Together, the publishers, the product owners, developers all needed to understand exactly what was to exist in order to be sure that we were going to have what the publishers needed into the future. This really is just a really good process of rapid prototyping. Now, it's hard to overstate and quantify just how much more valuable the conversational technical requirements were compared to the square peg round hole requirements that we were initially brought by the publishers. And more to the point, how much happier the publishers were with the results of our collaboration. Right? But to try to give you some idea, the customer presented requirements were something that I would loosely define as raising a few questions more than they answered and vague. And at the same time, our co-created understanding is something that's immediately actionable and implementable. Now, this talk has hypermedia in the title, and I haven't really said it much yet. So where is it all? Well, the only thing I've really presented is this really good but rather typical event storming type discovery session, rapid prototyping. We still have to implement some code and some software. We have to test it, ensure that it does what we want it to do, to define some security rules so we can ensure that the people who are supposed to use it are the only ones allowed to and are able to, right? Then we need to make sure they can be performant enough to handle our users. Then we have to put it in production, right? Well, yes, but there are a couple of pretty important points that I made earlier. Right? First was the code is not throwaway. Right? It is an extremely early version of the code that would be run in production when we delivered the code. Things would change, but this was not the end result. But this was not also something to be thrown away. Hypermedia was there from the beginning. It was used in the technology to enable the rapid prototyping process in the beginning. Eventually, it'll be used to run and operate the system and to define the process and the experience through the business process itself. Right? The client that we presented the users with through this rapid prototyping was simply using the rules that we had defined with the team. And if we can use it to present a UI to users, where else can we use it? So it turns out that when a vocabulary is followed strictly by a set of rules and the interaction is defined strictly with the business vocabulary and exposed using hypermedia, there's a large amount of work in testing, security, and operations that you can automate, right? And or immediately start once you've created the schemas, these messages, mappings, these resource mappings, and the business flows. So what does that look like? This may look like a typical waterfall development plan that you may see, whether it's agile or waterfall. This may end up being what you see. You first need to design before you can develop, before you can test, before you can assure that its performance is accurate, before you can secure and figure out how you're going to run it. It's very waterfall. But once we understand the conversational approach and design of these processes, the business vocabulary, and how this is designed, a conversational hypermedia approach may look something closer to this. And as someone who's been responsible for an entire life cycle of a set of digital products, the thought of being able to work on these traditionally quasi semi sequential activities concurrently is an absolute game changer. Now, there's a philosophy that underlines all of this approach in this process, whether we're talking about defining this vocabulary with the business or building this technology. Um, we haven't even begun to tap the full potential of what this approach offers, but we have seen some really, really promising results with what we have done. This philosophy between the architecture, the infrastructure, and interaction designs that we put together with this there has a core theme at the center, and that theme is very simple: reduce ambiguity. Now, I'm going to include a couple of slides here, so all of the points that I'm hoping come across here in this talk comes across, and I won't read them here. This is just for future reference, but there's one thing that I do want to point out before we proceed. This discussion and this story has really focused on success and how to be sure that your customers and consumers are successful. But I found that often that the more challenging and difficult scenarios are the failure scenarios or the issues where negative consequences or outcomes are arising. And this approach helps in those situations as well. Now, circling back to the key question that we started with this story with. As a API platform architect, how do I know that my customers and consumers are successful? Well, you start by asking them what successful looks like. And then you build an API platform to enable those kind of interactions and messages. And you watch the results. And you keep doing that until you know your customers and consumers are successful because they told you so. Thank you very much.